Innovation Seminar Series. All right. Click on that. Yeah, so welcome everyone to the Invention for Innovation Seminar Series. Today's session's on patient and public involvement and stakeholders in i4i projects. I should say this is the first of 3 sessions. The next one will be on clinical evaluation and validation in the i4i projects. And the last session will include IP, intellectual property and commercialization. I should add, as part of the process, my name's Brian Crosby. I'll be your MC this afternoon. Some notes I want to mention that we're having a Q&A panel at the end of all the presentations with all the presenters who will be present. So if you have any questions during the presentation, could you put those in the chat box? I'll monitor them and we can pick them up at that point. Of course, at that time, you could also ask questions to the panel, and I'll monitor those and make introductions to anyone who wants to ask the panel questions at that point. Anyway, let's moving on. So I'd like first to introduce Roy Harris. Roy is going to give us an introduction to today's session, and I should add that Roy is the Senior Advisor in Translational Research for the RDS in the East Midlands. Roy's had over 40 years experience of medtech device development and 7 years in supporting pre and post awards through the NIHR i4i grant applications. So Roy, could I hand it over to yourself to give us a brief introduction?
Thank you. Let's see if I can share my screen. Can everybody see the screen? Yes? No?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Welcome everybody. Brian's covered this slide. I just wanted to emphasize that this is the first of 3 sessions. Please get involved in not only this one, but the following 2. So to introduce this, this session, quick overview on stakeholders. People, research teams that I've worked with know about stakeholders, but don't really understand fully their involvement at times. Now, stakeholders can be all manner of people or organizations, communities, and it starts with your own research team. They are stakeholders, and it goes all the way through funders, manufacturers, your organizations that you work with or for, all the way to the NHS and beyond. So it's not 1 or 2 people you're talking about, it's quite a few. The thing about stakeholders is that they should have a direct interest in your research process. This is very important. And because of this, you need to identify your project stakeholders very early on, what their interests are, and also what their influences are. Now, influence is very important because a good stakeholder can influence the success of your project, and a bad stakeholder can actually bring about its downfall. So you have to be careful who you engage with, when you engage with them, and make sure they're the right stakeholders to be on board. Now, stakeholders come in with different titles, and here I want to mention primary stakeholders, which are normally termed your customers or end users. And people think in terms of the NHS or healthcare providers, medics and nurses, but included in this, very importantly, are your patients. Your patients benefit from what you're trying to do with your research, and they should not be forgotten. So in this session, we're going to be looking at patient and public involvement, and really the importance of the patient in trying to progress your project and support your project, and also all the other stakeholders and how to engage with them, not only industry, but other stakeholders. Now, as Brian said, please put any questions in the chat. But now I'd like to really start the session by passing over to our Regional Public Involvement Lead, Naina Patel, who will tell us more about the importance of PPI. Thank you, Naina.
Thank you, Roy. Right, just waiting for the slides to load up. Okay, thank you, Roy and Louise. So my name's Naina Patel, and I'm going to be talking about the importance of patient public involvement, PPI, in i4i subjects, projects. I'm the regional lead for patient public involvement at the Research Design Service East Midlands. Next slide, please. So the outline of my presentation today, I've divided it into 3 sections. Part 1, I'll talk about the requirement for PPI briefly and the contribution of PPI in i4i projects. And in part 2, we'll talk a little bit more in detail about PPI, the what, who, where, when and how. And in part 3, I'll signpost you to guidance and resources. Next slide, please. So here I'll talk about i4i and contribution of PPI. Next slide, please. So though this is quite a long quote, what I needed to do was just to establish how important PPI is in i4i directly from the NIHR. So here, what we see is a statement from the NIHR, which expects active involvement of patients and the public in the project it supports. It's anticipated that most i4i projects will have a significant PPI component, which must be clearly and fully described. Applicants should identify the relevant patient user groups for their application and engage with those groups at an early stage. So what I'm going to do for the rest of the presentation is sort of use the term PPI advisory group for the patient user groups, and for individual PPI, I'll use public contributor interchangeably throughout the presentation. Next slide, please. So whilst PPI is a requirement, I wanted to see what difference PPI makes in i4i funded projects. So it would be, let's turn to this evaluation report that was commissioned by the Policy Research Department in Policy Research Programme at the Department of Health. And it was conducted by RAND Europe in 2015, which is a non-profit research organisation. And the evaluation aimed to identify outputs and impacts of i4i projects and to examine the factors influencing their performance and the progress. And the evaluation was conducted by undertaking the following. It took a focused review of the background information from i4i, scoping interviews with key informants and a survey of programme participants. And it also undertook case studies of projects representing diverse technologies and health needs. And there's a lot of information in there about various aspects of i4i projects that you may find interesting to read, but I'm going to focus in the following slide on specifically with respect to PPI. Next slide, please. So it's those case studies that they had undertaken that I'm going to turn to. And here I've extracted the quotes from 4 of the case studies, and I'm just going to read them out. Basically, the team involved patient representative groups in the proposal development process, which helped to include an end user perspective in the design considerations. Early consultation with patients helped the project team better understand patient needs and how they relate to product design and function aspects across different areas of application and patient segments. And it created the opportunity to collect feedback on product design and testing throughout the project. Spending substantial amounts of time with patients helped to discover what the main issues they found important were and helped the project team to explore a range of prototypes. And finally, in hindsight, the team members noted it would have been good to have worked with even more patients at the start of the project to get a more objective understanding of the type of device that would work for different types of patients. So here, what we get is a snapshot of very clear reasons as to why PPI is important in i4i projects. So they've demonstrated the contribution of PPI in product design and understanding of the relevance of their product for diverse patient groups, and the relevance of projects to patient needs as well as their priorities. And it also shows the value of undertaking PPI early on in the research project. So I shall now move on to part 2, which focuses on PPI in more detail. Next slide, please. So what is PPI? And again, I'm using the NIHR definitions. NIHR defines public involvement in research as being carried out with or by members of the public rather than to, about them, or for them. It's an active partnership between patients, carers, and members of the public with researchers that influences and shapes research. It's not about informing people, or it's not about asking them to participate in the research. And I'll expand on that a little later in the presentation. Next slide, please. So who are the patients and public? And this gets quite confusing sometimes. So I think it's nice to actually have this spelt out for us. And so the term PPI includes patients, potential patients, carers, and people who use health and social care services, as well as people from specific communities and organisations that represent people who use services such as charities and support groups. Also included are people with lived experience of one or more health conditions, whether they're current patients or not. And it does not include stakeholders, other stakeholders, such as healthcare professionals, care workers, and commissioners. And my colleague Alasdair will explain what we mean by stakeholders later on in the session. And the reason why I've spelled it out is that in many of the applications that I've reviewed, just generally, and during my research career, that people do confuse kind of healthcare professionals and patients and the public, and confuse them and use the term stakeholders interchangeably. So it's useful to have that clarification from the outset. Next slide, please. So what the NIHR is also keen to ensure, and there's a real drive for this nationally and in the funding reviews that take place of applications, is the inclusion of equality, diversity and inclusion, which I'll abbreviate to EDI. So a diverse and inclusive public involvement community is essential if research is going to be relevant to population needs and provides better outcomes for all. But one of the things that I've noticed and heard about is that while you may have an inclusive PPI strategy and manage to get inclusive and diverse public and patient participants in your advisory group, it's also important to ensure that that EDI is embedded throughout your research plans, including, for example, your medical devices, in vitro diagnostics and digital health technologies, to make sure that they're relevant and can serve all patients and communities. But also importantly, that they don't inadvertently discriminate against certain groups of patients and the public. The next slide, please. So here's kind of the ramifications really of a lack of embedding in EDI and PPI and in research. And these are illustrated by this sample of media and academic journals. And unfortunately, I don't have time to go through all of these today, but let's just focus on the BBC headline, and given the disproportionate impact of COVID in BAME communities. So this one refers to oxygen monitors, which are designed to spot early signs of dangerous falls in oxygen levels in COVID patients. However, these work less well in people with darker skin. So both the NHS England and medicines regulator, MHRA, said that these monitors may sometimes overestimate oxygen levels in darker skins. This is because the devices that beam light through the blood and skin pigmentation may affect how light is absorbed. So how does this work in practice? Well, clinicians are becoming increasingly aware of the potential errors or inconsistencies associated with monitors. And in this article, a clinician in hospital discusses that he frequently comes across these monitor errors in Black patients. So in relation to the algorithms, I looked at a recent Parliamentary Science and Technology Committee report that was produced that was based between the period of 2017 to 2019, which discussed algorithms. And it says that when algorithms involve machine learning, they learn from patterns of data which may be incomplete or unrepresentative of those who may be subsequently affected by the resulting algorithm. So there can be an inbuilt bias and lead to discrimination. So what we need is algorithm developer teams that encompass a wide cross-section of society, or for the groups that might be affected by the algorithm, to ensure that a wide range of perspectives are actually subsumed in their work. Next slide, please. So one of the other confusing things is, where do you actually position PPI? And this is quite confusing for patients and the public that you may wish to engage in your PPI groups. And also sometimes I find that early career researchers who are not familiar with PPI can also be confused. So this is a slide that I often use and adapt it for the research project that I'm on. And I use it to explain to patients that, no, we don't want you to participate in the research. So in this case, a device, a medical device, or an algorithm or digital health technology. What we want you to do is, on the left-hand side, is, as the picture shows, is that we want you to collaborate with us, with the research team, to help shape and design the research. And this is quite new, particularly for underserved communities, such as those from BAME communities, because often, we're asked to take part in research. Very often, it's a new concept. What, you're asking me to help you with your research? How can I help? But that's another issue. But it's actually very helpful to actually help people understand where they'll be positioned in the research if they engage with you as PPI. Next slide, please. So when do patients, PPI, get involved? So as required by the NIHR, it should be from the beginning to identify the research questions. But in my experience, what usually happens is that research teams develop their questions and their priorities and research plans before they decide to collaborate or consult with patients and the public. And in some respects, having tentative plans is good, because you do need to have something to talk to potential PPI. But don't have them so developed and then you go to your PPI just basically in a tokenistic way. You really want to have meaningful engagement with your PPI. And that is really, really important. So, and it's also important to work with the group that you establish throughout the research cycle. So, and involve them as much as possible in all of the stages. And that can happen, including, the funding application stage, writing that and being informed in that. And you will be required by the NIHR, by your funding review panel, to demonstrate how PPI has made a difference in your research application. For example, what kind of changes did you make as a consequence of engaging with your PPI advisory group. What did they find beneficial? Were the patient outcomes that they identified and you prioritized in your research application? So you will be assessed on the impact of PPI in your research in your funding application. And the presenters from YPAG group and Michael in their discussions will highlight what this involvement looks like in practice based on their experiences. Next slide, please. So, how can PPI assist? As I said earlier on, pre-award, it's about identifying the research priorities. What the funding panel will want to know is how is it relevant to the patients that you've engaged with, and what are the benefits that have been identified. And in the funding application, there could be, and I find this with sometimes statistical projects, even with statistical projects, there are some ethical implications. So it could be, there could be ethical concerns. In writing up your funding application, PPI can assist with the research plans, the selection of the appropriate patient outcomes or the relevant outcomes, and the writing of the plain English summary. These are just a few of the examples. By no means is it a definitive list, because it will be appropriate to your research application. PPI can be involved as joint grant holders or co-applicants on a research project. And post-award, they can be involved in the development of a protocol, again, ethical implications, data collection methods. They could be involved in your data recruitment strategies. They could actually take part in the data analysis as well. So it depends on your project. There's a lot of opportunities for PPI to be involved. They could also assist with the study documentation, such as participant information sheets and other related materials, and developing dissemination strategies as well. So I'm now going to move on to the guidance and the resources that you can refer to for assistance. And again, I'm sorry to sound like a broken record, but I really need to emphasize the need to start early with your PPI. And for EDI guidance, the website has been signposted. We at the Research Design Service nationally and also locally, we've been involved with some of our public contributors to develop the toolkit for EDI, and there's a lot of explanation about that, about the terms equality, diversity and inclusion, how public contributors can get involved, what are some of the issues around PPI and EDI. So please do look up that toolkit. But if you're unsure of how to involve patients and public, speak to your RDS public involvement lead. You can also speak to your RDS PPI lead about accessing a small grant called PIF, Public Involvement Funding, to support your pre-award PPI activities. And they can support you on, recruitment strategies for your PPI and all different aspects of your pre-award PPI activities. When you're costing up your PPI, use the NIHR payment guidance for researchers and professionals to ensure you support your PPI contributors for their involvement and allocate a budget in your funding application. But please make sure that your PPI budget in your funding application adequately reflects the depth of PPI you're going to undertake. Only this week we had feedback from one of the funding committees for a research application, which questioned the amount that was allocated for PPI in a researcher's application. So that is looked at to make sure that it matches what you're proposing to do. Next slide, please. So people often ask about, do we need a public co-applicant? Well, there's no formal requirement. But again, refer to the NIHR guidance on public co-applicants. And one of the things that we do stress is that please be very clear and have clarity about the role and the responsibilities of the public co-applicant before you submit your application, because you'll be required to provide a description of the kind of activities and their role that they will undertake. I mean, just as an example, public co-applicants can attend meetings to shape and inform the direction of the research, oversee its progress, contribute to its delivery, represent it to other agencies, external agencies, and disseminate your research findings. And they can also act as a liaison between the PPI advisory group and the research team. The exact roles of the co-applicant, as I said, will need to be discussed between yourselves with the public advisory group, with the PPI advisory group, the public co-applicant, and the research team. Michael will, in his presentation, talk about this in more detail. And there's some more kind of narrative about some of the issues related to the involvement of a public co-applicant in Peter Bates's document as well. So there's often some confusion about the public co-applicant and the PPI lead. They're often used interchangeably. And what I need to just say is that the PPI lead is someone who's quite distinct from the public co-applicant. This is somebody within the research team itself who takes responsibility for coordinating the meetings and supporting PPI. Next slide, please. And finally, so some of you may have seen these, and these are the UK standards for public involvement. And these standards are for what good public involvement looks like. They provide clear statements and concise statements of effective public involvement against which improvement can be assessed. So researchers can use these standards to review their plans for public involvement, and research funders and charities can use them to assess how public involvement is being implemented in projects and organisations that they support. And members of the public, as well as community groups, can use these standards to assess the strengths and weaknesses of their involvement in the research and to identify improvements. And we encourage researchers to refer to and demonstrate how they meet these standards in their application form. Next slide. And thank you for listening. Happy to take questions at the end.
Thanks, Naina. Interesting presentation. Yes, I would add, if people do have questions, just to remind them to put it in the chat box. So next up, we have Michael Pryor. Michael is a public and patient involvement contributor for Nottingham University Hospitals and the NIHR Nottingham Biomedical Research Centre. So Michael will kindly come along today to give us a presentation on his experience as a patient contributor and co-applicant on an i4i project. Michael, are you set up and ready to go?
Sorry, am I still on mute?
No, you're okay. I can hear you. Fine,
thank you very much. So just a few words about me, first of all. Just a slight anecdote to begin with. I was at home on Friday, and as is often the case when I'm at home, I often have Radio 2 on in the background. And on the Jeremy Vine programme, they had a feature on the 50th anniversary of CT scanning, which I was very interested in. And the reason for that is that back in 1981, just over 40 years ago, when I was a graduate student at university, I had been ill for about 3 years. And despite being under the care of an amazing consultant, nothing significant could be found wrong with me. My consultant sent me for one last test to another hospital from Oxford to Bristol. That test was a CT scan. The CT scan showed I'd got a large abdominal mass, subsequently confirmed by abdominal exploratory surgery. And, you know, I mention that because CT scanning is, you know, something that I depend upon for being here with you today. I've had lots and lots of scans over the years since then. It's a fantastic example of innovation in clinical research. Of course, we've got MRI imaging as well nowadays. And yeah, doctors don't realize how much we depend upon CT scanning for and other types of imaging. After the tumour was diagnosed and verified with histology, etc., I went through a program of treatment. It wasn't clear whether there was any treatment that would be successful, but I had this program of radiotherapy and chemotherapy. They were both very, very heavy, but amazingly, I managed to get through it and managed to finish off my PhD work and began my working life up here in Nottingham, initially for what was the pharmaceuticals division of Boots, and then subsequently in forensic science. But over the years, I've had a lot of what we now call late effects from my chemotherapy and radiotherapy that were becoming more and more pronounced and affecting mobility and all sorts of things. And it led me to retiring, as you can see, it's over 10 years ago now. I started to think then about things I'd like to do, you know, retiring really quite early. And I became, I think through one of my doctors in Nottingham, became introduced to patient involvement in clinical research. And I've been sort of doing it ever since, particularly, but not only, in what we call the Biomedical Research Centre here at Nottingham, in gastrointestinal, hearing and musculoskeletal, those parts of the BRC. And actually one point arising from this side, trying to tie back with things that Naina just told you, you will often find it to be the case that the two P's of PPI, the patient and the public, are often embraced in the same individual, in the sense that the individual brings with them their patient experience or experience as a carer. That's really what motivates them to, if you like, try to put something back into healthcare. That's certainly the case with me. But they also bring with them all their outside experience in the rest of their lives. So, you know, get to know your PPI people, because you'll often find that their experience, in my case, in kind of scientific type work, in my working life, or it could be education, or it could be in hospitality with organizing events, or it could be in community work, or whatever, that experience can be very useful to you in your research as well. What sort of things do we do? What sort of things have I done? Well, with Naina has alluded to these. I've been involved in a lot of studies, and one or two involving industrial collaboration of the i4i kind. So it can be one-off focus groups, or a bit more deeply on a more ongoing basis in trial advisory or steering groups, lay assessing study documents, the documents that Naina referred to. So it could be the lay summary itself. The lay summary, by the way, is an incredibly important document. It's one of the shortest documents in the whole sort of pack of information you need to assemble, but people tell me it's in many ways the most important. Often you're limited to a finite word count, but the lay summary is your shop window. And often it's the case, I'm told, that some of the people on funding panels will not, maybe the main focused individuals who are looking at your study, some of the other supporting members of the panel will focus particularly on your lay summary. So as well as that, you've got the patient information sheet, the consent form. I've also looked at quite a few study protocols in my time. The next sort of level in terms of depth, in terms of involvement in studies, is being a lay co-applicant. I've been involved with a few of those. We can talk more about that in the questions if you like. And sort of outside of sort of study work, something I very much enjoy the chance to do whenever it's possible is to contribute to PPI education for healthcare professionals. So we've had stuff going on here in Nottingham for undergraduates, a module on PPI in their second year studies for PPI and clinical research. There's a program of PPI education for PhD level researchers that I've been involved with. And there's also something we do here in Nottingham to support people on the cusp of their first major grant writing, grant application, typically registrar level doctors. So myself and 2 or 3 other PPI people have an input to those as well. And I'm also involved in the kind of organizational side in sort of steering groups in some of the research areas I'm involved in. I don't want to dwell on this slide too much because you've seen the research cycle, I should say, in Naina's presentation. And of course, if I pose the exam question to you, in which steps on the cycle does PPI have a role to play? I can all hear you shouting all of them, because you'll have heard that in Naina's presentation, and hopefully a fair few of them will have known that anyway. But just to emphasize Naina's point, it is all too often the case that people like myself don't get brought into it until quite late on in the green box or even the blue box. And if we don't get involved until this sort of blue box here, by that point, all the documents will have been written and will have gone through ethics approval, which means it's very difficult to change them if we come up with comments and suggestions on things that really need to be approved. It's quite hard to do that when they've already gone through ethics. So a few learning points arising from my experience. Get help and advice on PPI, whether you're on the healthcare side or whether you're on the commercial side. In the case of an i4i type application, there are lots of great people out there, some of whom are my colleagues speaking here today, and Naina and the RDS organization are fantastic advice as well, because a lot of this doesn't sort of come naturally if you're coming into it in for the first time in your research. Get PPI involved early in the process. Hopefully that point is well and truly hammered home from things Naina and I have both been repeatedly saying. Consider training for your PPI people, and training, as I've alluded to, for yourselves as well, so that you understand the nuts and bolts of the PPI. And one of the benefits of training, if you do it for the team as a whole, is that you'll build the team. You will get to know your PPI people if they're in part of some kind of training induction sort of process for your study as well. And that's important, particularly if you've got a group that's going to be in a long-term study that could be in existence for maybe three years or more. So investing that time at the beginning really pays dividends. In the case of an i4i type application, one of the things that rears its head is obviously the commercial in confidence type issues. And I've put here, deal appropriately with them. It is not appropriate, I would suggest, to put a confidentiality agreement, an NDA, or whatever you call it, in front of a PPI person. I don't think that is right. I don't think that's the right way of going about it. What you should do is approach the research department associated with the institution that is providing that side of the support. There will be people there who will deal with that for you, and they will explain the significance of that to the PPI people, particularly in the training that I've alluded to in the previous point. Budget adequately for PPI. I make no apologies for just repeating Naina's point here. If you put in just a lump sum for PPI, it tells the funding body a story about really that you haven't thought through the PPI in any sort of detail. If, however, you put in a budget that is quite detailed, talking about different activities where you'll be involving your PPI people, it shows that you've thought it through, and it's a really good thing in your favor. It tells a big story about how well you've thought through PPI in the whole of your study, not just for your PPI people. Capture your PPI input, capture the evidence of what your PPI people have contributed. Again, that's a repeat of one of Naina's point, but it's so important. One of the weaknesses at the moment is that we haven't got as good a baseload of evidence to sort of publish on the impacts of PPI as we would like. And often, by the way, capturing PPI input is just having good meeting handling skills, taking notes properly of the interventions, suggestions and inputs that people have made, particularly your PPI people. And finally, adopt what I've called learning and continuous improvement mentality. Apologies if that's a bit of kind of my management jargon from my working life, but learn from the experience. Make sure you have a sort of lessons learned wrap up at the end of a study with your PPI people. Talk about what could be done better, what went well, and all of that you can feed into your subsequent studies. You'll get better as you go along. And just finally, 4 points here, which I think are inevitably in the minds of your PPI representatives. So certainly in my mind, at the end of any PPI sort of encounter, what we want is to make a contribution. That goes right back to, my own story about my own healthcare. Being kept informed. Sometimes, clinical research goes through highs and lows of excitement. There can be periods when there's an awful lot going on leading into a funding application, and then everything goes quiet. Keep your PPI people informed. And that can be just sending them an email every couple of months or so they know what's going on. Look after them. If you've got people with mobility issues or hearing impairment or whatever, make sure you understand their needs and look after them. And make sure you try to help them enjoy the experience, because if they are enjoying what they're doing, they'll want to do it again. They'll come back and they'll help you more with your research in other studies, and they will help others as well. And finally, just a few pleas. Involve us PPI people, because you really believe it will add to your research. There's plenty of requirements now. It's mandatory with many funding applications that there should be PPI, but there is a world of difference for people like me if we are being involved in a study because of that reason, as opposed to because the researchers really believe it will add value to their research. Get to know us, get to know people, our backgrounds, because you will find all sorts of things out that will be useful, not just their patient/carer experience that can help you with their study. Some meeting skills, by the way. I've been in some studies where one of the PPI reps had fantastic skills at chairing a meeting, and he actually chaired some of the study meetings for the researcher. And spread the word. Hopefully spread the word going forward from today's event. Be advocates for PPI, and it will help it get further embedded in the future. Questions? We don't have time now. I'm pretty sure of that, but hopefully we've got a bit of a slot at the end, and do put questions in the chat to me, or I'll be delighted to answer them at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for those insights. Yes, we'll take all questions and put it to the panel at the end of all of the presentations. If we could move on next. So the next presentation is a case study of PPI in action. We've got Kate Frost, who's Head of Patient and Public Involvement and Engagement for Research and Innovation at Nottingham University Hospitals, NHS Trust. She's joined by Luca Marciani, Professor of Gastrointestinal Imaging, Faculty of Medicine and Health Science at the University of Nottingham. And we're also delighted to introduce members of the Nottingham Young Persons Advisory Group. So, Kate, are you?
Yes, I'm going to do a brief.
All right, yeah. You starting off.
Screen. While Luca shares the slides. So, I mean, I have followed Michael at previous events, and it's always an interesting experience because he's so fantastic at presenting. But hopefully, now what we're going to do is provide you with a slightly different insight and provide a case study about involvement of children and young people throughout all stages of the research cycle. So that goes from concept right through to dissemination. And we are going to hear from our fantastic members of the Nottingham Young Persons Advisory Group as well, who will be co-presenting with Luca Marciani. So just as an introduction, my name is Kate Frost, and I'm the Head of Patient and Public Involvement and Engagement for Nottingham University Hospitals Research and Innovation. As part of my role, it's fundamentally important to ensure that we are involving those who are frequently referred to as underserved, as Naina has referred to in the presentation. This includes a breadth of communities and individuals, but in relation to our presentation today, it includes children and young people. And you can on screen at the moment see our fantastic young persons advisory group at some of our sessions we've held pre-pandemic, unfortunately, but we have moved online during the pandemic. As we do in adult research, it's important to include children and young people's voices in all clinical research that's relating to them. So again, to repeat the mantra, that all research is done with and by them and not to them. So to support this, Nottingham University Hospitals developed the Nottingham Young Persons Advisory Group, also referred to as the YPAG. And this is a group of heterogeneous children and young people aged 8 to 18. So the group consists of people who have a mixed breadth of lived conditions to share their experience of this. Also, young people who have been involved as participants in clinical trials, and others who have a great interest in medicine and clinical research. So what I'm going to do now is pass over to Luca and our Young Person Advisory Group, and they're going to give you a case study of patient involvement in action. So Luca, I'll pass over to yourself if that's okay.
Thank you so much, Kate. I hope everybody can hear me. I will move the slides with this then. So I'm absolutely amazed by the fact that there are 60, 70 people giving up part of their working day to listen to PPI. This wouldn't have happened a few years back. So this is absolutely fantastic. I am a basic scientist. I'm not a clinician. I'm an imaging person at the University of Nottingham. And myself and Bethany Naina from our Young Person Advisory Group will share some of our experience on the MAGIC project. This is a couple of grants funded by NIHR Invention for Innovation. I need to stress that I'm speaking for myself. I happen to be a committee member on the funding committee of i4i, but this is just a talk made as a customer of the grant. And I will give a brief introduction to the project, very brief, and then I hope we will show you some of those contributions that both Naina and Michael was talking about. And I will show you some of the PPI really in action. So I will take just a couple of minutes to go through the background to like to understand where the project sits. And the project sits with pediatric constipation. It's a big problem. 14% of children suffer from constipation at some point in their life. And fortunately, most of them are sorted out by either the parents and carers or by the GP. 600,000 a year in England and end up at the GP. But about 30,000, they actually end up in hospital, mostly as outpatients or emergency admissions. And managing the illness in these young patients is actually challenging. And the diagnosis is often unclear, and the symptoms are often reported by proxy. And an objective measure of how the gut function, how it can move things along, which we call the gut transit time, could potentially help with the selection of therapy and with the management of the patients for the consultants. There is an old method from the 1980s to measure the whole gut transit time, one of the most common one, which is called the X-ray radiopaque markers, or ROMs. This is where you give people loads of little pellets, often on several days, to load the bowel, and then you can take an X-ray, shown here in the picture, and you look how far or these pellets have progressed or not. And that's the problems with that. The problems are that it gives ionizing radiation, which is not good for children. Children have a longer lifespan, and younger organs are more sensitive to radiation. So any radiation that can be avoided in children is a good thing. And also you can see from the picture that the definition of the anatomy from the old frontal X-ray is not particularly good. So it's difficult to tell where the little pellets could be. So our NIHR i4i grant was a very simple idea. So we said, can we make a modern equivalent of this old method using some of the imaging techniques that Michael was mentioning, so MRI, magnetic resonance imaging. And so we proposed to create some mini capsules filled with fluid that you can actually view on MRI imaging, and to demonstrate that we can make them and that they can measure transit as the old technique did. It has been funded by product development awards from Invention for Innovation and IHR, and is the story that links us with the patient and public involvement for the seminar today. And we had a range of PPI in our project. We started from back in 2015 with a parent co-applicant to the grant, a parent advisory group, and of course our Nottingham young person advisory group. And we said in the grant to the funder that they will actively participate to the design, the device, the kit, the recruitment, and will help disseminating. And I'm hoping that we can show you that we did. In answer to one of the points that was made before by Naina, this needs to be planned and needs to be costed properly. And our PPI budget was serious. It was 4 to 6% of the total of the gross grant in both cases of the two grants we had. These are pictures from one of our adult advisory group meetings. And we've done quite a bit in this space. And I'm really, really proud to say that the funder has actually acknowledged this and recognized our work. And we've actually ended up being in the NIHR evidence alerts from June this year as case study of patient and public involvement. I'm sure you don't want to hear all this from an old scientist. You want to hear it from the people that actually did the patient and public involvement activities within the project. And so I will very happily pass the word to Beth first and Inaya later. Beth, are you here?
Yes, hello. Great. So like Luca said, I'm Beth. I've been part of the Nottingham YPAG group for over 6 years now, and I've been part of Luca's Magic research project the whole time that he's been involved with the YPAG. So this is one of the first sessions that we did with Luca. We learned all about the gut transit process, and you can see in the photos we even designed our own intestine with pipes and marbles. This is a great way to learn about the problem that Magic aimed to solve. So we understood more about what type of capsules would be needed and what the device would actually be doing. On the left there, you can see myself and the rest of the YPAG helped to influence the size and shape of the mini capsules. And I think this is really important because as young people, we have a different insight into what might be most comfortable for the participants that are going to be using these capsules. Next slide, please. We're then able to help design the packaging for those mini capsules in a later session. And I think this was one of my favorite sessions that we did with Luca. Looking back, it's great to see how our ideas, such as using a blister pack type of design, really made a difference to the plans that the manufacturers drew up that you can see there. And then the final pot on the right, in the bottom right, it's amazing to see it come from start to finish with our inputs in there. Next slide. Thank you. So another amazing aspect of the study was getting to be involved with a voiceover for the Magic Beans informative animation. So we got to help craft this into something that we thought young people would actually really understand and enjoy. And it was really cool to see a magic bean talking with my voice. I played the part of Beanie Q, who was a bean reporter in the gut, which was great. And again, the YPAG got to help review these videos and make them suitable and hopefully really useful for the Magic participants. So hopefully that had an impact on how comfortable they were entering the study, which is great. Next slide, please, Luke. Finally, I attended the grant management meeting with Luca last year, on the left there, and I was able to speak to a lot of people involved with the study about how YPAG has helped to shape Magic over the several years we've been involved. It's a really great opportunity, and to see the different impacts that YPAG has had over time has been really interesting. So I can't wait to see what happens with the study and with Magic 2 next. And now I've got some other slides with Anaya.
Hi, I'm Anaya. I've been at YPAG since about 2019 now. I've been helping with YPAG because I have an interest in medicine. So when we started out, I was helping with some ideas and the rest of YPAG. So for the ethic materials, so we could write down all of our ideas, because I think as younger children, we see how we impact it differently. So it was really nice to see how our ideas helped with magic, and the ethics committee commended us because we worked with patients instead of talking at them, which I think was really helpful. Next slide, please. We also have a project website, which we have our own space on. We could talk about what we do, and we upload photos from our meetings, and just to say what we do and how we've helped. So they can see all about the Magic Study website and what we've been doing and how we've been writing it down and things like that. And next slide, please. So we also co-authors on some of the papers. One was about the clinical trial and one was about our involvement with magic. So we, as you can see circled, we've got the Young Persons Advisory Group, and the other one was the involvement. So it was nice to see how we were actually co-authors on it because of our help and how it's impacted it. Next slide, please. And finally, just to show our appreciation, we helped think of some gifts and tokens of appreciation just for the young participants. So we've got a Magic 2 bear there, we've got some water bottles, and just to show how much we appreciate what they've done for us and how they've helped us. And thank you for listening.
This is absolutely brilliant, Naina. Thank you so much. This is just my last slide. I hope we have conveyed some of the things that Michael was saying at the end of his presentation, that the enjoyment. This has been a fantastic, and is today a fantastic journey that I think we all greatly enjoyed. We met probably 16 or 17 times with the YPAG in long sessions discussing things and planning. And the other point that to make probably a personal one, but I think it could resonate, is not just for what you do with PPI, but it's what PPI does to you, how my bearings on research and how to deal with the object and the people that you're dealing with in your daily job has changed thanks to the involvement with the YPAG and with our adult group. So one slide to say what's happening next. We've been lucky to be funded for Magic 2, which is a continuation of the study. We made the device that Bethany and I were describing, and we need to then prove efficacy. So Magic 2 is a large project that will try to bring this to a different level in a multi-center trial and scale up the manufacturing and go to CE marking for the regulatory approval. We've been hit really hard by COVID, the pandemic. We're late, we've been sweating, but we haven't given up. We're picking up the pieces. And now the research, and particularly the clinical research in the trusts, is improving. We're making a start again. So it hasn't been particularly easy in the last few months. But I hope you enjoyed our story, and very happy to take questions later. I think Bethany and I may have school things to attend, so if they need to go, we'll excuse them, and thank them so much for taking time off their studies to come and talk to us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Luca. Really great presentation. Thank you, Luca, Kate, and the young people from YPAG. Super. Up next is our last presentation of the afternoon. It's from Dr. Alasdair Gaw. Alasdair is an innovation advisor at Medilink in the Midlands. Previously, Alasdair was with the Innovation UK and AstraZeneca, where he was involved in creating and managing the management of several international consortia. Alasdair, you ready and set? Great.
Can you hear me okay, guys?
Yep, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Is this what? Yeah. So I work with Medilink Midlands. We are a networking organisation within the Midlands and the life sciences sector. Our main aim is to drive innovation and new product development within the life sciences. And we deal a lot with small, medium enterprises. The idea is to help them connect with the right people to move things forward. One of the reasons we're associated with RDS is good academic ideas need to be scaled up and moved forward. So our aim is to try and get better industry engagement, etc., to try and help move a lot of these things along. We signpost to funding aspects, different opportunities, and we provide some grants for SMEs. With its specific special interest groups, we try and bring academics, clinicians, patients together to actually in key areas like digital health, medical tech, regulatory. It's more for information and for training to move it on. But over the years, I've worked in pharma, I've worked on innovating in vitro diagnostics. I've worked closely with NIHR. We've seen a lot over the last 10 years of the movement from patients being people that things were done to patients being people who tell you what they're willing to have done to them and what their actual needs are. So we've even seen charities change from funding basic research to funding care, because it's what the actual people suffering from those diseases require. If you look at Arthritis Research UK, they've expanded to use osteoarthritis, and it's about better care treatment for patients. So when you look at the pharma, biotech, medtech sector, stakeholders really are people who've got an interest in moving a project forward, whether the interests are financial, physical benefit, or it's something to do with the company. Everybody must benefit from it. So traditionally here it's academia, academic clinicians come up with ideas, businesses come up with ideas. They both work together to sort them out. You need clinicians to then actually test a hypothesis. The regulators are there to check everything's safe, but to try and get safe things into the system. And then everyone thinks the NHS is the end user. So patients are at the bottom here for a reason, because patients are actually the foundation and the key stakeholder, because if you don't make a patient feel better, you ain't going to sell it. If you don't improve the patient's life, you ain't going to sell it. If they don't want to take it, the CCGs don't pay for it and nothing else happens. And it's not that you should develop it up until the time you hit the patient. And you've just seen a great example there from Beth and Naina of using the patient to market to actually find a way that makes it more acceptable for people to use, but also in the early phase of the design of how the product comes. So in my environment, I think of innovation and technology readiness levels. This comes from NASA. So 1 to 9 is taking a product from idea through to ready to take to market, okay? The issue in this is, if you think of Neil Armstrong, we talk about moonshot plans nowadays constantly. But for Neil Armstrong to get to the moon, there was a giant team behind it, different people, engineers, biologists, rocket fuel chemists. And then there was all tendered out to whoever could provide it at the lowest price. So it wasn't always the most effective. So there's a few mistakes along the way, several things crashed and burned in the design process. And then you learn with hindsight. So you take that to the technology readiness levels. If you go to the end of it, what can you learn from the end that can then set up the beginning so you can make it happen more easily? So as you go through it, early stages, pure research happens in universities, research centres. As you come through, one of the key stakeholders are the people who fund it, because all this stuff takes money. So in the UK, we're lucky, we have good, we've had good investment through the research councils, Innovate UK for industry. You see the NIHR gets funding for moving good UK inventions forward. The charities provide a phenomenal amount of funding in the UK, probably over 50%, about 1.2 billion they put in just in the medical life sciences ones. The regional enterprise groups and then private investors who actually see a return for them at the end. But the rest of them are actually stakeholders that see economic growth, or they see a benefit to the patients that they represent. So when it comes to the charities and patient groups, they are phenomenally important for one key thing. You can talk about a target product profile when you start off with your great idea that my drug or med tech device will do this. However, you need to sense check it. Now, I've met a lot of companies over the years that have developed a great idea and then wondered why no one wanted it. And it's because they never actually looked at the end user to see who would use it. And if you look at the right-hand side of my slides, you'll actually see that you've got the clinical groups, you've got private hospitals, you've got all the main customers, care home providers, department and trade want any of your ideas they can sell abroad and bring in overseas investment. And you have nice regulators at the end. So they have all got a vested interest in things coming out the other end. But again, the patient has to be using it. So I spent most of my life in pharma. And when you look at pharma, many of the treatments, if they don't, a lot of the drugs don't get taken by people. There's about 60% of the non-conformance is because people don't like the drugs, because they're taking drugs that don't have a symptomatic relief. They don't actually have a physical effect on them. So your statins, people who seem to have still have high cholesterol, you find they don't really take their statins regularly. People whose blood pressure fluctuates a lot, you find they forget to take their drugs because it's not a thing that shows automatically on them. So when you come to your design, you've got to think of those markets early. What's the clinical designs that you do to show a benefit? And again, what impacts in humans? So within our environment in this country, we have fantastic national resources. We have innovation competence centres that link everybody across the country. We have catapults, for example, medicines that they bring in different aspects so that small companies can find the right people to grow with and grow. We also have groups that are designed to actually help them develop within the NHS. You've got the medtech and in vitro diagnostic cooperatives. Locally, we have Cheetah, which tests things to make sure they're suitable for the NHS. And we've got clinical trial units to actually test them. The Academic Health Science Network is part of the NHS, and that's to try and drive adoption of these new technologies just when they're ready to go. But as we keep hearing here, the patients are the key part of it. So you can make it, and this diagram shows all the people who make things ready, suitable to go into the NHS. But these are the physical aspects of reproducibility. How does it happen? So what you need to do is go back to the beginning and say, instead of working so far through it and then discovering that it's not fit for purpose, because, for example, the patients can't inject themselves because they've got rheumatoid arthritis, I have to design a different injector. So you do it earlier and then you test it in different parts of it. So the stakeholders are an important part of moving your project forward, but you actually need to keep checking and sense checking with the patient so it's going to work in the right way. Then once you actually get to the end of your product launches, it has to be able to be acceptable to patients. So for example, in Japanese people like small tablets, they don't like big tablets. So you're trying to develop a drug that's small. And it's what's the social acceptance of things. So again, as a continual learning process happens, this is one just to show the technology development is not a linear process. It's continually revising, relearning and redesigning. So you get lessons from research as things are ongoing, regulators, and the patients for benefits. The suitability for patient use is a key bit. Clinicians can override and keep dosing people, but the patients must still decide if they're going to take drugs or use medical devices at the end. So if they've got a CPAP machine, for example, with COPD that's too noisy, that stops them sleeping, it defeats the purpose of having the oxygen to help them sleep at night. So but when we look at the Midlands, sorry, I hope you can actually see this slide. We have the Midlands Engine and MI Health that work across the area, and they're trying to drive for all the stakeholders in the region in the life sciences. NIHR has got fantastic institutions, Institute of Translational Medicine, Birmingham, Midlands Health Alliance, Derby Clinical Trial Support Unit. We have all of the BRCs across the Midlands, Nottingham, Leicester, for example, and respiratory. And we actually have the medtech technology support, which fits in that innovation delivery system. So we're in a very, very strong position in this country. I really hope you're not seeing exactly what my slides are. Yeah, and we have so East Midlands, West Midlands, and we have the Chamber of Commerce for taking things on. So if you're an academic developing an idea, make sure it fits, that the patients use it, that it's suitable for people. We call it human-aided design, but think from the word go about where the product's going to go. And there's plenty of organisations in this region which can actually help you to move it forward. You can't do it on your own. You need to work with different people. And that's patients, business, the entire regulators, as early as possible to try and get through things as quickly as possible. And more importantly, as cheaply as possible, because that keeps the funding stakeholders happier than anything else. So in that note, I'll leave you. If anyone has any requires introduction to anyone, then please get in touch, and we can set you up with different aspects of manufacturing people, etc. And I'll leave you at that. Okay, take any questions.
Thanks, Alasdair. Yes, great. Can we have